independence, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 2. I Resisted All the Way. Hello, husband.
Hello, underhand little thing.
Oh. Just for the listener, Mike is picking quotes from the novel to call me, and I don't know what he's going to say, so I don't know how to feel about this
Chapter
quote.
2 is not good for
little Jane?
Chapter 2 is not good for funny quotes that are relating to a character.
Yes.
Madame Mope was fantastic for chapter 1. I
Right.
like that one. I want to bring that up again in case there's another chapter which doesn't have some sort of nickname that I can apply to you.
Oh, I see. I thought you were going to start calling me Madame Mope when I'm moping about the house.
I will. That's going to be a given from now on.
Oh, okay. Before we get underway, I just wanted to mention that I wanted to add audio clips to this podcast series to kind of illustrate different points of the book. And I went through a few options of like what audio to add, and I ended up going with my favorite adaptation, which is a 1973 BBC miniseries production with Sorcha, Cusack, and Michael Jayston. I don't think it's a well-known adaptation, but I think it's the best. And I feel like you really enjoyed it.
Yes. I mean, you showed me all the 24 adaptations of Jane Eyre, and that one, it's thorough. It's more or less unabridged.
I think it's very thorough.
It's pretty complete.
Yeah.
And I will tell people that we did watch it all in one day.
It's 5 hours, yes.
Yeah, I think we took a nap between a couple of hours, stopped and took a dinner break, because I think it's broken up into like 4 parts, right?
5 episodes.
5 episodes. Okay, yeah. So that made it a little bit easier. But yeah, it is the best, and it features, again, one of the better Rochesters in Michael Jayston, and Sorcha Cusack is a really good Jane, and like even all the supporting roles are done really well. They seem to be what I picture when I was reading the novel.
Yes, that's something that really struck me when I was watching it, is that I feel like especially Michael Jayston really brought to life the Rochester that was in my head when I first read the book. So hopefully if anybody out there hasn't seen it, you can find a copy and enjoy.
And now it's great that we get to call Michael Jayston our friend.
Yeah, I guess that's another story to share about how I met Michael Jayston, but we'll save that for another time. Yeah. For now, let's get into our chapter summary. Chapter 2, this is again from the SparkNotes website.
SparkNotes!
2 servants, Miss Abbott and Bessie Lee, escort Jane to the Red Room, and Jane resists them with all of her might. Once locked in the room, Jane catches a glimpse of her ghastly figure in the mirror, and, shocked by her meager presence, she begins to reflect on the events that have led her to such a state. She remembers her kind Uncle Reed bringing her to Gateshead after her parents' death, and she recalls his dying command that his wife promised to raise Jane as one of her own. Suddenly, Jane is struck with the impression that her Uncle Reed's ghost is in the room, and she imagines that he has come to take revenge on his wife for breaking her promise. Jane cries out in terror, but her aunt believes that she is just trying to escape her punishment, and she ignores her pleas. Jane faints in exhaustion and fear. So, in this chapter, we get pretty much all the backstory of Jane and her parents and why she's at Gateshead, who Mrs. Reed is.
Yeah.
As you mentioned in the previous episode, we have a little bit of an exposition dump with John Reed, but now we have a much bigger one as Jane gets introspective in the Red Room.
You read more than I do. I think we established that in previous episodes. And I know, we talked about it on the last episode. Chapter 1 is very short.
Yes.
And I don't read enough to know, do authors try to put all the exposition in the first chapter? Are the first chapters a little bit longer so that they can do that? Or do they do a better job of trying to spread it out more?
I feel like that it's more common to try to spread it out. I think it's a fault of a book if it's all in the beginning and it's kind of dumped on the reader quickly. So yeah, I think this is probably pretty normal.
Yeah, I mean, I compare it like I mentioned before. I'm more cinematic in my in my visions of art and stuff, and so I think about like, yeah, you usually don't get a lot of the exposition in a movie in the first 5 minutes.
Right.
It's usually spread over the first act, which might be about a half an hour. So in this case, in a book, it would be the first 100 pages or so, right? And so I thought that was, like we said, we talked about it on the last episode. It was interesting that so much of the exposition of Jane is told through John Reed insulting her.
Yes.
And that's all we know. Oh, she's only brought here. She's not welcome and all this stuff. And so in chapter 2, yeah, we get a continuation of that exposition. I put in my notes that it's a companion piece to chapter 1. Now, I assume that's something that happens a lot in books. Chapter 2 should be a companion to chapter 1, but it's not such a specific delineation. Like chapter 1 ends with her being taken to the Red Room, and chapter 2 begins with her being pretty much, I don't know if she's even in the room yet, right? She's still being brought over there.
Yeah.
So it's almost like it's pretty much the same chapter. Like, why even split them up at a certain point, right?
That's interesting. I mean, it's kind of marking that Jane is becoming rebellious. So that's a big moment for her, maybe. That's why you just end it on that. I also think it's interesting because chapter 1, with John Reed mentioning these things, probably the reader has some questions of like, oh, well, what does that mean? Who is Mrs. Reed to Jane then, and why is she a dependent? So then chapter 2 gets to answer all your questions, all your burning questions as a reader of what is happening with Jane and who she is.
Yeah, and now you get Jane's perspective, which is what I liked. Because obviously John Reed's going to have his own ideas about why she's here and why she shouldn't be there. And whereas now, chapter 2 is almost virtually just an inner monologue, which I guess happens a lot in books that are told from the first person perspective, right? And so you put her in a silent room where there's no one else to talk to her, and now she gets to tell the reader, okay, here's why I'm here, here's where I'm at. But she doesn't just lay it out in bullet points. Okay, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It's more about we're going to start to see the elements of the supernatural, like we said, that she thinks there's a ghost in the room, and so she's dealing with fear, but then she's also kind of talking about, this is specifically why I'm here, because my old uncle, who I liked but who's not here anymore, he told his wife to take care of me, and so now it's all those questions you may have had from the first chapter. Yes. You find yourself going, oh, okay, that makes a little bit more sense, because I don't know, is Mr. Reed brought up in the first chapter? I know we just read it, but I'm like, I don't remember it, unless Mrs. Reed mentioned it in passing, or...
I don't think so, but then obviously there's a Mrs. Reed, so maybe the reader's like, well, where's Mr. Reed? So then you get that information. And
there's children, so you don't think of, single mothers in Victorian era England in the mid-19th century probably was frowned upon, so there must be,
a reason why, Yeah.
And they also, I guess, made a lot of the men die young back then too, unfortunately, right? So that was the case. But yeah, so like I said, it's not to get too cinematic, but I always joke, Charlene and I are both huge fans of the James Bond franchise. And I like how those movies are such standalone pieces. It's easy to change the actors. Charlene prefers Roger Moore, I prefer Sean Connery. The Pierce Brosnan movies are fun. The Daniel Craig ones have been pretty good too. But when Daniel Craig took over the role, his first movie was Casino Royale. His second movie is Quantum of Solace. It's the first time that we really saw like a sequel. Like,
I see. Yes.
Casino Royale is like chapter 1 of the Daniel Craig story. Yeah, like it ends with him. He's leaving to go someplace, and then I think in Quantum of Solace begins with him arriving at that place that he came to. Right. So it's like it was a little bit jarring for someone like me. I don't know if it was for you to watch 20 years or have been watching these movies for 20 years, and all of a sudden you're like, I'm not used to them picking up where the previous one left off. Right. And so this was, like I said, literally she's like, take them to the Red Room, and then it picks right up. Like, I'm guessing perhaps, and maybe I'm going to answer my own question, this idea of why wasn't it all just one big chapter? And I think maybe it's because of the whole inner monologue. Because in the first chapter, we get Jane having conversations with her aunt, with her cousins. John, I guess they're cousins, right? Yeah, and then we get all the exposition from John, and now it's like, okay, now this is my turn to tell my story to you, so you don't have to hear it from this pissant, as we called him in the first chapter. Yes. And so it's like, okay, we'll make it a separate chapter because it's my introspective moment for me to tell you why I'm here and maybe draw some sympathy because I just got picked on in the first chapter, and now you can relate.
Yes. And I feel like the second chapter is interesting because it introduces an element I think you mentioned before, the supernatural, which brings us to a genre that this book is a part of, which is the Gothic literature genre. And I was wondering, for you, I know you've seen a lot of films that maybe have been termed Gothic. What does Gothic film or literature as genre mean to you?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I know we had talked about this off the air, and that's a term that I think just gets thrown around so much.
It has a lot of meanings, yeah.
Yeah, you hear it a lot, but yet, is there something precise? We talked about movies earlier. When someone says film noir, you know what that looks like: black and white, harsh shadows. Usually has like a detective or something. There's certain elements of film genres. You're more literary, but it seems like the literary genres are just so much more all-encompassing, right? When someone says fantasy,
yes,
right? I mean, you're going to get specific. What about, like we talked about it, I think, on the last episode, YA. Isn't young adult does that encompass a lot? Because you could have YA fantasy, YA
That's
romance.
True. As a genre, it's more just an age group, or it's like a demographic where you have certain things allowed. So, like, you don't have a lot of, sex or horror or something like that, and it's more geared towards the mindset of a younger adult.
But then, why is there a young adult section at Barnes and Noble? Isn't it usually like it had?
Well,
like,
there's
like
a children's section.
Well, but there's like I feel like there's a YA section at Barnes and Noble. Then I guess it goes into subgenres, doesn't it?
Yes.
Isn't there YA romance and YA fantasy?
Yeah.
Isn't there a section at Barnes and Noble that's like, not werewolf fantasy, but it's like.
Their specifics.
yeah, where it's like, okay, Twilight created this section at Barnes and Noble,
sure,
where it was like supernatural romance or something like
Yes.
that, yeah. But yeah, so to go back to Gothic, like it's something that I've heard all my life. You hear it related to movies, and yet I really don't know.
Right.
We joke about it, but like I think I put in my notes that I have this image in my head of like book covers. Featuring women in like long flowing gowns running from large old houses.
Yes.
That's when the term Gothic just gets thrown around for anything that is like considered creepy but also like it's never modern.
Sure.
And I think you've got it in the notes.
It's a little old fashioned.
Yeah, and I think you've got it in your notes that isn't Gothic an architecture?
Yes, it is. So I was wondering, there was a time when I was interested in the origins of Gothic literature. So I saw some reference to the idea that maybe these homes and these stories are sort of Gothic architecture, and that's why it's called Gothic literature, which I'm not sure how true that is, but makes some sense to me, because I feel like that the idea of a big forbidding house is kind of an element you see a lot in Gothic stories. And I feel like I gravitate a lot towards those kinds of stories. I like stories about big forbidding houses and sort of an innocent woman having to deal with the intrigues or danger that's in that house. So stories like Rebecca, which is also inspired by Jane Eyre. So Gothic stories appeal to me. And perhaps it's stemming from the fact that I love Jane Eyre so much, and Jane Eyre has a lot of these Gothic elements, the supernatural being one of them. You have that virginal heroine. You have ghosts, mystery, madness, secrets. Those are sorts of things that come up a lot in Gothic stories. And it melds sort of the fantastical with the realistic, which is something that in Jane Eyre, in this chapter, we get that realism, because Jane is grounded in her feelings, her fears, her anxieties, but now we're just getting the introduction of a possible ghost, and that's something that sets up maybe in later chapters other elements of the supernatural, which would feel out of place in a book that was supposed to be realistic. Charlotte Bronte is setting up to know this is going to be a realistic story, but it will have some supernatural elements.
And that's what makes it Gothic, right?
I believe, yeah. I think that really lends itself to the Gothic genre.
Because this is all new to me, because I feel like, and you could attest more to this having read more books than I do, the idea of the Gothic, having subgenres, again, Gothic romance. But yet, when I think of Gothic, a lot of times the first thing that comes to mind is horror.
Sure.
I think of, we go back to the films. I think of Vincent Price in a big old spooky house. I think of, yes, a lot of movies from the 60s, low budget, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, a lot of those Hammer horror films.
I feel like Gothic stories can often swing more towards horror or romance. Like one of the original Gothic stories is Dracula, and that's obviously has more horror elements to it than romance elements, but there is some romance elements to it. And in the movies, I don't know if you've seen the recent film. I can't remember when it came out, actually. It was Crimson Peak.
I heard of that one, yeah.
And that was just total homage to Gothic stories, and it has a little bit of romance, but then a great big horror section. So it was a really good film. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, and that's what makes Gothic so unique, because of the fact that you're not supposed to have horror and romance in the same story.
Yeah, it's such an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, and that's why, like I said, when you gave me this book to read, I feel like I heard the term Gothic romance at some point. I did not go into it thinking that it was going to be too horror based or too maybe a little bit of supernatural. And I think that's when you asked me again earlier what I thought when I think of Gothic especially as a literature genre, and I think about there's got to be some element of supernatural, but at the same time it's not necessarily dominant or overpowering. It's just enough to put the reader on edge, and we're going to get it with Jane Eyre as we move forward, where it's like, okay, something is not quite right at this house. Yes. And whether it be the house she's living in now or the house where she's going to be living in a few years.
In all these houses that she's in.
Yeah. The common theme is Jane. So you're like, what's going on? Like, why is there something a little bit off? And I think maybe does that make it Gothic? That there's the romantic elements. It's not straight up horror, but there's something. Like I said, is it a ghost? Is it not a ghost? It's enough to make the reader uneasy, but also put them on the edge of their seat as it draws them in, and they're going to continue reading.
Yes.
And that actually leads me to a question that I had for you, which was, do you think that the story of Jane Eyre could stand on its own without these Gothic elements? Like it's this sweeping romance that draws you in. It could be, dare I say it, Jane Austen,
No, you dare not say that.
That it draws you in, but it has this extra level of suspense and wonder that makes it, does that make it that much more memorable? Like, would this been okay if it was just a straight romance story without these supernatural Gothic elements?
I feel like it loses a little bit of the interest, perhaps, if you have it just. There's no mystery, are you saying? So there's no
what's going on in the house. It doesn't matter. It's just I'm a governess and I'm falling for this stuffy landowner that I think likes me, but he's not going to tell me because he's tight, stiff upper lip. He's Mr. Darcy. Here we go again. Sorry, it's the
Well, the intrigue. Should come from somewhere. Obviously, Pride and Prejudice has intrigue in the form of Mr. Wickham and how he takes away Lydia, and in the form of Mr. Darcy and his actual true personality, which we don't know. Whereas with Mr. Rochester, I feel like his mystery is a lot more interesting because it's sinister, and Jane is confused, and the reader is confused. Whereas I think in Pride and Prejudice, it's a lot more clear to probably the reader that Mr. Darcy is a good man, or he has potential as a suitor, that we don't really we're more invested in how they're going to get together, and that's basically it. So that in Jane Eyre, when you get to certain elements of their relationship and the romance, you're not sure exactly what's going to happen. And maybe they do love each other, but they're not going to be able to get together for whatever reason.
Yeah. No, I'm just curious, because I feel like those supernatural Gothic elements are what kept me interested, at first, because again, I said I wanted to read Jane Eyre because I know how much it meant to you. So I was always going to do that.
Yes.
But if you had said, hey, Mike, my favorite novel is Pride and Prejudice, would you read this? I wonder if that might have been a little bit more of a chore. Charlene did show me the wonderful adaptation the BBC did with Colin Firth.
Yes,
and that was good. I liked it more than I thought I was going to like it.
Oh, yes.
And I want to say, how do you know off the top of your head how much earlier Pride and Prejudice was written before Jane Eyre? Was it?
I want to say maybe 35 years.
Okay. Yeah, and maybe that's what I'm guessing. I'm going to take a wild guess and say that Charlotte Bronte probably read it.
Yes, actually, she has a quote about it. I will pull that up right now. Charlotte Bronte wrote to a critic, G.H. Lewes, saying, "I have not seen Pride and Prejudice till I read that sentence of yours, and then I got the book and studied it. And what did I find? An accurate, daguerreotyped portrait of a commonplace face, a carefully fenced, highly cultivated garden with neat borders and delicate flowers, but no glance of a bright, vivid physiognomy, no open country, no fresh air, no blue hill, no bonny beck. I should hardly like to live with her ladies and gentlemen in their elegant but confined houses." So she's a little bit critical of the lack of drama, I think, in Jane Austen's works, which is fair enough. Jane Eyre has its fair share of drama.
Yeah. Like I said, I think I'm glad that this was your favorite book and not Pride and Prejudice.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I still would have read it. I still would have probably enjoyed it.
You haven't read Pride and Prejudice. You might read it and think, oh, this is kind of a... Jane Austen has a very interesting, cynical humor to her that I think is entertaining.
Yeah. I mean, I did see the film version from 15 years ago with Keira Knightley and Judi Dench, and I don't remember much about it. So yeah. But then, like I said, the one with Colin Firth was a lot better. But anyway, this is not a Jane Austen podcast.
No, it's not.
And I'm sorry. I know how much that riles your bones when Jane Austen gets more attention than the Brontes.
When people confuse Jane Austen and Jane Eyre.
Yeah.
So something in this chapter that struck me, I think, was that Jane's anger at the injustice of her situation feels so strong, and I think it's partly because she's a child, and that feeling of injustice. I feel like when I was a child, that idea of, oh, this is not fair, really rankled with me. And I like that Charlotte Bronte brings that to young Jane, where adult Jane can be a little more forgiving, and young Jane is not. So I thought, did you feel that element stuck out with you?
Well, I mean, it's something that was brought up in the first chapter, or at least kind of talked around in the first chapter, and we see it more. Again, this is her inner monologue. This is her giving the reader her side of the story. Like, I wonder if is she acting out, because yes, it doesn't seem fair. There's injustice, but I also wonder, like, did she feel abandoned? And that no one's helping her, that she's stuck with this Reed family, even though, she doesn't want to be here. And then the fact that, that she has her own disappointment in that, Mr. Reed wasn't alive to see this, wasn't alive to see her being mistreated, which winds up having her conjure up this spirit from beyond the mortal realm, And so I think, I think you mentioned it before, that sometimes children have always, that's the easy retort when they don't get something they like. This isn't fair.
Right.
This isn't fair. And to some extent, maybe they are right. Especially if you've got kids who have siblings. You have brother and sister. I have a sister.
I feel like when I was a child, if one of us, I have two siblings, if one of us did something, then we all got punished, and that was not fair. I didn't like that at all. I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
And I'm sometimes reminded of that feeling when I read Jane Eyre, that first couple chapters of how I hope that's not an issue that I haven't dealt with. But
did you ever get in trouble for something that your siblings did? Like the idea of getting. I always joke about it. I love my sister to death, but when we were growing up, she's 6 years older than me. She used to pick on me, and she used to boss me around whenever my parents weren't around, and she had control in the house. It wasn't to the level of John Reed, but I think that's something. I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to when they read a book, is that they've had an older sibling that maybe I feel like that maybe it's high school, college age when you start to really, really care more about your siblings, because when they're young, there's a little bit of rivalry, probably, right? Sometimes
I have a little bit of annoyance at them sometimes.
Yeah. And this idea of fairness is something that everybody can relate to. And, I feel bad that Jane has to go through this. You're hoping that's going to make her stronger. But like you said, the injustice continues. And we've already talked about it in the last episode about this being a patriarchal society. So she's got that going against her. Yes. And she's been orphaned. And the people who are taking care of her don't seem to care for her. And that's making it even worse, to where it's like into the red room. And
you get locked up.
Yeah, into the red room, and if only you were one of us.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, so that takes us to the Red Room, which is such a big figure in this novel, I feel like, especially in later analysis and interpretations where people have a lot of ideas about what the Red Room means, and the idea that Jane is being locked up in a world where she is also constricted by her gender, her class, and how that figures into her story arc, because she needs to break free of these things. And in the end, when she does, that she's happy.
So she's kind of like a bird in a cage.
Yes, yeah, that's a good symbolism that comes up, and I feel like it also prefigures other women locked up in places that we might see in the later part of the book.
Ooh, spoiler! Well, that's the Gothic. It's so Gothic.
Yes.
This woman needs to get out of the house in her long flowing gown and run.
Run away.
And run away, and then we get those elements. But, well, why is the room red, though? Why is that something that happened in a lot of these old houses back in the 19th century, where they would choose one color? Or not even red, but they would just be like, okay, we're going to make this room just completely green, or this room, some sort of design motif.
I'm sad that I can't speak to that. I really don't know. On one of my trips to England, I visited Buckingham Palace. They do the tours there, and there are rooms that are colored, like their blue room or white room or something. And that maybe does speak to the idea that they like to have singular colored rooms.
Well, but then why do you think Charlotte Bronte chose red?
I think that is something else that's been up for interpretation on whether that means blood or anger or the womb, which it does seem a little bit of a stretch to me. I just wonder, Charlotte Bronte just picked red for no reason. But
but red is a passionate color, and I was mentioned before that, like, I think that's one of Jane's signature qualities, is that she has passion.
Yes.
And I wonder if that's what Kerr Bell was putting into this book as she was writing it. Did she have that foresight, or did she just like the color red? I wonder. Yeah.
I don't believe Charlotte Bronte had a red room at the Haworth Parsonage.
No.
But yeah, I think it's an interesting idea, and it certainly makes a great visual when it comes to the adaptations, to have that feeling of anger in Jane visualized with her surroundings of red. So, it's up to interpretation, definitely.
And like you said, could it be like a womb? I don't know. Mrs. Reed infantilizing Jane, wanting her to change. Because I feel like, conversion therapy, we know how well that works out, But at the same time, it's like, does she just like, if only you were like my kids.
Yeah.
Would she care a little bit more? So it's like, stick her in the room, hope that punishment
will get to her.
Yeah.
And she'll be a better child.
We can disclose to the listeners right now that, Charlene and I have been married for 3 years. We've been together for longer than that. We do not have children. No. And so I wonder, what does it come to when it comes to doing punishment for kids? Sometimes you don't know, like, what's going to be the best thing, especially when it's not your child. This is a niece of yours, right? And you just alluded to it a second ago, that even your mother thought the best way to punish them for something one of them did is to punish all of them and hope that they'll get together and be like, hey, don't do that, because now we all have to face the wrath.
Now that I'm older, I think that also my mom was just tired and she didn't want to have to figure out who's to blame. She'd just punish everybody and be done.
I wonder that's what Mrs. Reed is dealing with. Now, granted, I mean, she's got a big old house.
Yeah.
She's got 3 kids. She's got a son who just doesn't, like I said, she loves the son. The son is kind of like embarrassed by the mom.
Sure.
I mean, I know she has help, but she also doesn't have a husband. Yes. Her husband is deceased. Mm-hmm. And so I think maybe that's one of those situations where, again, she's a little bit fed up because now there's a 4th kid in the house.
Yeah. She just doesn't want to have to deal with Jane. So I'll just lock her up and try to forget about her for a little bit.
Maybe. And then that leads me to the one more question I wanted to have before we move on, which was, like, regardless of the morbid quality of being in a room where somebody had died, like we've established that the Red Room is supposedly where Mr. Reed had breathed his last breath. Mm-hmm. But I was going to ask you, could you handle spending time in a room like that was decorated and designed as it was in this chapter? Like, would your mind instantly wander? Because, there's no phones, There's no television. You're just in this room. If you can get past, like I said, get past the morbidness of it. I don't think I could get over that. We've been to museums. We've been to houses where I'm sure somebody died in the room, and you're like, okay, it's fine. I know that brings down the price of when you resell certain houses on the market.
Yes,
but
not in this market. But
well, yeah, if only someone would hurry up and die in one of these houses that Charlene and I are trying to buy. But could you handle living in that room or having to stay in that room? Because I think she mentions there's no books, right?
Right.
There's just this giant mirror that could make things a little bit more eerie, Gothic, if you will. But could you deal with that?
Well, I feel like I would kind of enjoy if it was a really nice room. Like I don't think I would be that bothered by it. I could just, they have a nice big bed you can lie down in. Jane likes solitude sometimes, so as I do. So it would be maybe nice. I don't know if she had a light in that room, so maybe that would be really creepy. It was just got darker and
candles,
darker in
maybe,
there. Yeah.
And stuff.
I wouldn't like to be in a dark room all by myself, probably.
Wow. But I don't think Charlotte Bronte established whether or not Jane likes naps as much as you do. So I mean, just this giant bed.
I just project that on Jane. I'm sure she loves naps.
But it's like I said, there's a line, there's a quote that I wanted to pull up where the way that Jane describes the Red Room because I guess she's been locked inside, and she says no jail was ever more secure. And so you're like, does it feel like a jail cell? I mean, the room is not tiny, but it's also not expansive, right?
Yes.
Like there's a bed and there's a mirror, but other than sleeping, if you were wide awake, you have to
look out the window. I don't know.
That's yeah. So maybe it's like being in solitary confinement.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's not pleasant, I'm sure.
Yeah, but anyway, all right. Well, that was. I just dropped a quote, and so I know we like to do on this show. We like to end the episodes by bringing up a meaningful passage or quote from the book as well. And if you don't mind, Charlene, I was actually going to start with mine.
Sure.
Superstition was with me at that moment, but it was not yet her hour for complete victory. And I like that quote a lot because I feel like it's as if Jane is having an anxiety attack in a way. And I say that as somebody who has experienced them and I know how crippling they can be. But what I liked is that she's strong enough at age 10 to know that the fear around her is irrational.
Yes.
Like she attempts to explain she mentions that there's a light that comes through the room, and that's where she's like, oh my God, is this the ghost of Mr. Reed coming back? But yet when she first describes it, she tries to explain what it is rationally. She's like, oh, it must have been a lantern from outside. Like she doesn't immediately go to by saying it's a spirit. She says this light came through. I'm sure it was a lantern. I'm sure it was somebody passing outside. But I think in a way, I believe it could be a ghost.
I think in the book, Jane is retrospectively saying that she believes that it was just someone crossing the lawn with a lantern. So I don't know if she, as a child, was thinking that.
But it's interesting because at least, when you're reading it, like, why would the author not bring that up after the fact? Like, when she introduces the idea of this light in the room, like, it's almost like Charlotte Bronte wants to tell you the first thing. Okay, I know it's not real, but but we talked about this Gothic, the idea of a Gothic romance, or at least a Gothic literature. Why would you not just be like, oh my God, there's a ghost in the room?
Sure.
Because why would you not say that first and then say, now that I look back as an adult, it probably wasn't that. But it seems like
that element of realism that Charlotte Bronte is still trying to keep to the story, as Jane is a rational person too, like you said, that she is thinking things rationally. So we're highlighting that Jane is a very level-headed person.
Yeah, and I think children do have an imagination that can tend to run wild, and so I think that's what I like about these first couple of chapters, especially this chapter, is that line between fantasy and reality is slightly blurred.
Yes.
There's a great quote as well. I almost had this quote as my quote as well. When she's looking into the mirror, she says, "quote All looked colder and darker in that visionary hollow than in reality."
Right.
So it's like, again, she knows, unless it's another one of those retrospective quotes where it's like, little 10-year-old girl she's not totally freaked out. I mean, she's enough to where she's going to scream and try to get help.
Yes.
But she's also trying to kind of convince herself that it's not real and she has to kind of get over it. And to be honest with you, and I say this from experience, that is how you come to grips with an anxiety attack.
Right.
Is that you have to kind of tell yourself it's okay. This is not as serious as you think it is. And so again, that's what I like, that dichotomy in Jane, and that's what kind of adds to her personality to give her more depth.
Yes, that's a great point. So my quote recalls Jane's anger at the injustice of her situation, and it's, "I dared commit no fault, I strove to fulfill every duty, and I was termed naughty and tiresome, sullen and sneaking, from morning to noon, and from noon to night."
But I, who dared commit no fault, who strove to fulfill every duty, I was termed naughty and sneaking, from morning to noon, and from noon to night.
And it just brings up this description of Jane that's so alien to the reader, of her as naughty, sullen, sneaky. Like, all of these things are not true about her. And as we learn more about Jane, we were aware of that this is just an inaccurate portrait of her and how unfair it is for her to be seen like this. I just think it's such a great encapsulation of that.
Yeah, I think we kind of alluded to that in the first chapter as well. Like, Jane seems to be so much more concerned with what other people think of her. Mm-hmm. And she wants to make sure that she's, judged fairly. Which, again, I'm sure all 10-year-olds probably do. Yes. But I don't know, there's a greater sense of it I get from this book when I read it. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that concludes our discussion of Chapter 2, Jane Eyre. Thank you for listening. As we are a new podcast, we would love to get the word out and have more people join us in celebrating this novel. So please subscribe and review us on your preferred podcast platform and tell your friends. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I also host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.